Welcome back to Men and the City, coming at you today from a very snowy Moscow, but I've got a treat for you today. In today's video, we're going to talk about the future of Western philosophy with an artist, an author, and a good friend of mine named Constantin von Hofmeister. So like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the conversation. Welcome back to Men and the City. I hope all of you are doing well. In today's podcast, I have a guest who's also a friend of mine, Constantin von Hofmeister. He's a German who is currently in Moscow with me. In fact, we're about 30 minutes or thereabouts from the Kremlin, from Red Square, on a customarily snowy day here in Russia. For my audience, they know I absolutely hate the cold, but you probably don't think it's all that cold. In any case,
I'm not a fan of the cold myself, to be honest.
In any case,
I prefer warm weather.
What we're going to talk about today is the state of Western philosophy and the state of Western man, as we understand it. So before I start, I want to just do a little bit of background on you, Constantin, for my audience. Maybe say a little bit about your Substack, a little bit about the work that you've done, and maybe a little bit about your background before we get started.
Well, I'm originally from Germany, but I lived in different countries half my life. I lived in the US like 12 years, lived in Russia for approximately 10 years, lived in Uzbekistan for a year, lived in India for 3 years, traveled extensively, like all over the place. I was editor-in-chief of Arctos for 5 years.
Right.
Managing their books and their online journal. About a half a year ago, I founded my own publishing house called Multipolar Press. Set up the company. The process took several months, but everything's ready now. We're going to start publishing books next week.
That's exciting.
The first book,
Congratulations.
Yeah. So the first book will be Multipolar Galaxy. So Star Wars as a myth of civilizational rebirth.
Okay.
Which was written by me. It's my third book. My first book was called Esoteric Trumpism, which was published at the beginning of January 2024. My second book was Multipolarity, ! January this year. And now, I guess, January 2026 will be my third one. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to people's reaction to my new book. And I have a lot of other books in the pipeline by a variety of authors on a variety of topics.
Yeah. And how best to follow you? Is it Substack or?
Well, it's Substack now. It's like I have multipolarpress.com, where I publish articles by different authors on the general topic of multipolarity from a civilizational, historical, economic, philosophical, and artistic perspective.
Right.
And then I have my own personal Substack, which is eurosiberia.net, where I only publish my own writings, as different philosophical essays, basically on, again, a variety of topics.
Right. Okay, excellent. Thanks for that background, and that'll play a role probably later on in the interview / discussion, because that's really what I want to do with this, is have a broader conversation. It's an interesting time to be in Russia today, not just because of the special military operation, the war in Ukraine, which appears to be going the Russian way, but also escalating. It's also interesting because Russia has been through a lot, certainly over the last century, but they seem to be trending in the right direction, particularly noticeable to me coming here in Moscow. Moscow is in much better shape than a lot of Western cities. That all suggests that the rest of the world is sort of marching forward, developing, improving, but the West is not going in that direction at all. And what I want to do is start with a quote from a philosopher named Jorjani, who has an interesting Substack. I'll link to that below. He wrote an essay called The Philosopher's Task, and I think there's a very compelling paragraph at the beginning of that. I'm just going to read that to you, and I'll get your reaction. He says, "The catastrophe of our civilization, its spiritual exhaustion, its loss of creative direction, is mirrored precisely in the disintegration of philosophy from a way of being into a bureaucratic discipline. The philosopher's task, if there is to be any future for civilization at all, is to reignite that fire, to remember that thought is a form of warfare, and that wisdom is never the possession of the complacent, but the striving of those willing to risk everything for insight." What are your thoughts?
Well, it's a very deep quote, and I should say that it's accurate. I would agree with the sentiment expressed. And I'm not sure, though, how applicable it is to the West, to the modern contemporary West. Because, in my opinion, the West is basically in terminal decline, and the end of the West is inevitable. I don't really believe that the Western world, especially Western Europe, can somehow experience a sort of renaissance or be resurrected. So when you look at it philosophically, because now the state of philosophy in the West today is basically just analyzing or recycling old concepts, basically.
Right.
Like nothing really new is created. I would say, with the exception of Jorjani. Jorjani himself, he describes himself as basically the last or the only Western philosopher, right? And yeah, I would agree with the sentiment. I mean, I'm very familiar with Jorjani's work because I edited his books for Arctos.
Right.
And the kind of a system that he created and the meta-narrative, where he basically has novels and non-fiction books, but they all reference each other, and he himself appears as a character in some of his novels. I mean, it's very esoteric, and I'm not sure if it's meant to be taken literal when you talk about like time travel,
Right.
Reincarnation, the Nordic elite, UFO, flying overlords, you know.
Right.
Well, he himself says it's
Yeah.
literal, it's
Yes.
true, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's a sort of like esoteric meaning behind it all, yes? And the concepts that he explores are absolutely unique. And that's why I think he qualifies as a unique philosopher of the West, because he's very passionate about the defense of the West.
What would
Yes.
you say are the recycled philosophical ideas that need to be flushed, if you take my meaning, that predominate in the West today? So let me put it differently, because what you're advancing is a kind of Western eschatology of sorts,
Right.
that I know is rooted in Spenglerian thinking. This is your view, but what are the sort of frameworks of analysis from a philosophical standpoint that people are using in the West that you think are completely broken?
Well, you have the categorical imperative by Immanuel Kant, for example,
Right.
right? I mean, that's been beaten to death basically in
Right.
the West, but people still use it, right?
And maybe
to-
define that a little bit for the
Well, the
audience.
categorical imperative is basically like what you don't want to be done to you, you shouldn't do to others, basically, right? And I mean, it's become a sort of cliche, in my opinion. And the point of Western philosophy is that today it's very technical, in the sense that it is very moralizing in a universal sense, basically. So you have, for example, Martin Heidegger, right? Becoming to Death, for example,
Right.
right? Where you accept the finitude of existence, where
Right.
you accept that you will die, right? Because most people in the West today, they cannot accept the fact that they will die, right? So it has become a very, I would say, risk-averse society, and I think that was very evident during the quote-unquote COVID pandemic, right? Which, in my opinion, was not a conspiracy. I think it was just a hysterical overreaction, especially, I mean, triggered in the West, because
Right.
the West couldn't handle the fact that maybe some people died. Not, I would not say as a result of COVID, maybe some as a result of COVID, but also because you had a lot of, like, I would say, sick people in the West, like suffering from various ailments, I don't know, like diabetes, for example, and then they
Yeah.
got COVID on top of it, and then they died. So, I mean, a lot of them died with COVID, not necessarily of COVID, but some also of
Yes.
COVID. But the point is that all these lockdowns and the mask mandate, this was in direct opposition, basically, to Martin Heidegger's basically life-affirming dictum, becoming to death, where you accept the fact that you will die, and therefore you try to make the most out of life. I guess it's very similar to Nietzsche's eternal recurrence,
It
right?
is, yeah.
Because Friedrich Nietzsche, the precursor of Martin Heidegger, had this idea that well, the concept that everything that happens today will happen again and again and again and again,
Yep.
right? That's why I call it the eternal, also the eternal, eternal return, eternal recurrence.
Yep.
A lot of people misunderstand like Nietzsche's concept because they think it's somehow like maybe about parallel universes or reincarnation or something, but it's none of the sort. It's just like it's a philosophical construct because it's not meant to be taken literally.
Right.
Basically, it's like a thought experiment. Basically, he argues that you should put yourself sort of like in a frame of mind that everything you do now will be repeated endlessly. Therefore, every action you do should carry significance or real meaning.
Right.
That's why you should always be careful what you do, what you say,
Right.
to give your life more gravitas,
Sure.
basically. And this has been completely lost in the West, basically, because we live in a completely superficial world.
Yes.
Right?
Well, another way of saying that, I suppose, is consequentialism.
Exactly.
Right? That
Right.
everything that we do ripples through time and makes impact, that we have agency. This
Right.
is why I think a lot of Western folks actually are turning back to Nietzsche. One note that's interesting is that you mentioned Heidegger and sort of embracing death or the prospect thereof. A very good book that I don't know if you're familiar with, but it was called Denial of Death. It was written by Ernest Becker.
I've heard of the book, I haven't read it.
Which
Right.
sort of argues that the framework of understanding the world for humanity is to deny death.
It's absolutely
right?
true.
It's sort
Right.
of the inverse of that. Do you think that the myth of the West today is nihilism? Do you think that the myth is that we reject myth today?
Yeah, no, I would actually disagree because the West created its own myth, right? Which is liberalism, democracy, all these like catchphrases that the
Yep.
West uses, and they propagandize it in all media, like I don't know, Netflix, TV series,
Right.
movies, in school, and so on. So the West created its own meaning. So I don't think it's nihilism because I think nihilism can be interpreted negatively or positively, right? If you look at nihilism in a Nietzschean sense, I would say it's positive, right? Where you basically accept that there really is no overarching meaning in the universe, right? Therefore, you have to create your own meaning, and that's where the whole Overman comes
Right.
into play, the Übermensch, right? And well, regarding the topic of death, it's quite interesting since you quoted Jorjani at the beginning of this podcast, because Jorjani himself does not believe in the finality of death,
Right.
Because I mean,
He believes in reincarnation.
he believes in reincarnation. I believe in reincarnation. I mean, there's some scientific basis to it. Like I think
Right.
I talked to you about it a couple of days ago at the University of Virginia. There's a division of perceptual studies where they
Yes.
did like literally thousands of case studies over 50 years of children with past life memories, and they verified like the facts that the children mentioned.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult to explain where the children had knowledge of previous personalities from, if not for reincarnation, right? So, I mean, there's really some solid backing. There's some solid grounding to it. So, but then, of course, the memories very often don't carry over if you're reincarnated. But so, I mean, you have consciousness, soul, basically. I mean, it's basically the same thing.
One wonders,
but,
too, if that's not an expression of archetypes.
Yeah, well, I think the argument can be made, right? I mean, like Jorjani says that he was in Atlantis before, before it fell, basically.
Right.
I mean, he says he has fragmentary memories, and there are other people who say, I mean, L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, I think he said that he was a sort of like, not car, but it's like sort of like a race car driver on an alien planet in his past life.
Yeah.
I don't know.
L. Ron Hubbard said a lot of things.
Right.
This
yeah.
is true.
So yeah, but to get back to my point real quick. So basically, the West is not nihilistic. I mean, it's trying to overcome nihilism, and it's trying to overcome death because it cannot accept the fact that people are mortal, basically. So now, I mean, for example, cryonics is becoming very popular, where people freeze either their brain or their whole body, basically.
Yes.
In the hope that technology will advance enough that at some point in the future they will be sort of resurrected, right? I mean, all of this has religious overtones, of course. It's like a religious substitute.
Maybe that dovetails with the transhumanists as well, a little bit.
Well, it is transhumanist, right? Because, I mean, because you're basically contravening the biology, right? I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not opposed to these things, right? Because I'm not like a Luddite against technology or anything. because I basically subscribe to Guillaume Fay's archaeofuturist vision, right, where which also ties in with Julius Evola to some extent, like riding the tiger,
Yes.
right? Basically, we are in a situation that we cannot change in the West. Now, with artificial intelligence, it's not going to go away, no matter how much you might hate it.
Yes.
You can't put the genie back in the bottle.
Yes.
So you can only harness it to your own needs and to your own objectives, which is what a lot of societies are doing right now, right? Even traditional societies like China, India has a space program, all named after Hindu gods.
Right.
I mean, NASA, I mean, all the spacecraft, like Apollo, for example, were named after Greek gods. I mean, there's a reason for this, right?
A couple interesting things just to note real quick is you mentioned that you don't think that the West or Western philosophy, at least, is nihilistic because it deifies, let's call it liberalism,
right,
or globalism, something of that nature. But if you look at poll numbers from Western men,
right,
not the elites,
okay,
but the populace, their trust in democratic institutions, and you might even say their belief in democracy, is falling, and it's falling precipitously. Do you think? And I'm going to use a quote here that comes from Nietzsche as well. I think it goes back to the genealogy of morals. What Nietzsche says is, for a temple to be erected, a temple must be destroyed.
Right.
So do you think it's possible that the failure of globalism, the disbelief in it, will not necessarily lead to nihilism, but will get us back to some kind of mythical framework? And let me add one other thing to this too. In addition to this sort of disbelief in democracy as a functioning form of government in the West today, and again, I think that the evidence for that is legion, there also appears to be a resurgence of interest in Christianity, or resurgence of interest even in, you might say, ancient mythology. There are strands of this that are growing. This is something I've talked about on this channel, a kind of neo-masculinity, a revival of archetypes that are settled in a modern framework. Do you think that the shibboleths of liberalism can be destroyed and that a new myth can replace it?
Well, several points to address here. So first of all, I don't believe in democracy. I think it's not like Churchill said. I think he said something like, democracy is terrible, but it's the best thing we have, or some ridiculous nonsense.
Yes.
I mean, he was not
hardly a ferocious defense of it. Yeah.
He was a terrible person, Churchill. I have no sympathy for this man whatsoever.
Yeah.
And it's a horrible quote.
And you're just as an aside, your reasoning for that is because you think that Churchill was instrumental in the destruction of maybe the West, or causing
partly.
Partially.
I mean, mostly because he was a war criminal, and many British people acknowledge this today with the indiscriminate bombing campaigns by the British over German cities in World War II, like targeting civilians on purpose, right? Which basically achieved nothing, right? Just killed millions of lives needlessly and destroyed like ancient cities, ancient buildings. So
and real quick, I mentioned that just because the myth of Churchill is very tied to the globalist order today.
Well, that as well.
And so, as you say, there is a growing skepticism of Churchill and a revisionist account of that. So again, is that not congruent with smashing these legacy temples to erect something new? What say you?
Well, possibly. So just real quick about democracy, I just want to give you some examples, like why you don't really actually have a democracy in the West, right? Like, well, I'll give Germany as an example because I'm from Germany. So now, for example, in Germany, as is well known, you have the alternative for Germany, the AfD, right? It's basically the only patriotic opposition in the country, that has success, basically. I mean, there are many small organizations, but they don't really matter. I mean, the AfD has now an approval rating of 26%. So approximately 1/4 of Germans approve of what the AfD stands for, which is basically less mass immigration and more sovereignty, right? Like, for example, don't make Russia your enemy and don't refuse Russian energy like oil and gas on ideological grounds and thereby hurting the German economy. So they want to revive the German economy. They want Germany to be a more sovereign country, and they want less immigration, right? I mean, if all very reasonable positions. I mean,
course.
they're not even extreme. So, I mean, of course, in the media, they're vilified, right? Neo-Nazis, fascists, racists, but they're none of this. They're neither. I mean, there are black people in the AFD in high positions. They're Arabs, in high positions. They're absolutely not racist whatsoever. Nothing is race-based. It's like Trump, basically. It's purely economic. Their anti-immigration stance, right? So the AFD participates in the electoral process, right? It's a major party. But like when you watch the German news or listen to the German radio, like the commentators or the moderators, they always use the phrase, the democratic parties have said this and that. What do they mean by this? They mean all the parties except the AFD.
Right.
I mean, is this really by design? So they're basically implying that the AFD is somehow not democratic. But what do they base this on? On nothing, right? Because the AFD never ever said anything that could be construed as anti-democratic, right? It's not like they want to install a dictatorship. They never said this. They always said, yes, we believe in democracy, we're democratic, we want to change the system by democratic means, and so on. So, I mean, it's a pure vilification campaign. And it's not just words, it's also actions, because now you have like mayoral elections in Germany. Like recently you had one in the industrial city of Ludwigshafen, which is in southwest Germany. And the mayoral candidate from the AFD, like he had a very, very high chance of winning the mayoral election. But just weeks before the election, they just excluded him, basically. They banned him from running. On what grounds? Because in Germany, unique, of all Western countries, you have the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, which is basically like the Stasi, right? So it's like a secret police, basically,
right.
that spies on on the German citizens, and tries to find statements or comments that citizens make that, in their opinion, contravene the democratic order, right? So they claimed that this mayoral candidate somehow was an extremist with extremist views that are not in line with the constitutional values that they try to protect. Therefore, they barred him from running. So he didn't run, and somebody else won, obviously, right? I mean, how is that a legitimate election? And, well, Romania, you had Ceausescu, where the guy who was actually going to win the presidency, then they nullified it. No, the election doesn't count because the Russians, had some bots on TikTok, supposedly. Never provided evidence.
Yes.
I mean, this is what they do. So it's not democratic. There's no democratic system. It's an illusion, right? I mean, there's no free speech, but we don't have to get into it. Everybody knows.
Again, if you see that, do you not think that others see that?
No, a lot of people are seeing this. That's the point. Like if you go on like social media, like X, for example, the comments are full like of Germans that they can't stand the state of affairs, basically. And to get back on the philosophical track, what you said about religion, the revival of religion, more people becoming Christian, and trying to move away sort of from the liberal degeneracy that the West is now engulfed in. I want to just quickly mention 2 points also by Oswald Spengler, the German historical philosopher, who's mostly famous for having written in the 1920s the book The Decline of the West, which is, it's very famous, where he already predicted, the decline of the West, the death of our civilization. And, I just want to quickly outline his basic idea. So the basic idea is that in the book, that civilizations or cultures are like organisms, basically. So they are born, they mature, they grow old, and they die. Yes, and according to Spengler, it's inevitable. Like there's absolutely nothing that can be done. It's like a biological organism. There's nothing you can do. It dies, and that's it. And that's why his history is basically cyclical, not linear, right? And according to him, a culture is when it is youthful, vital, full of energy. When it atrophies, when technology takes over, when people lose their creativity, basically, their will to power, then it turns into a civilization, and afterwards it dies eventually.
Right.
And, we're in this phase in the West, right? Like we're in the civilization phase. I think there's no more vitality, there's no more energy. That's why you have this like postmodern phenomenon, like Hollywood, for example, where they just recycle old movies over and over again, like making remakes. You have like these meta narratives, same in literature, right? But then nothing really new is created anymore because there's nothing left to create, right? In the Western soul. So the Faustian spirit, the spirit of always going further, has basically withered and disappeared. And according to Spengler, in this phase of the West, you have this phenomenon of what he calls the second religiousness, basically, where people, because they can sense they're in a dying, inside a dying organism, seek solace in religion, basically, right? But it's an illusion, right? It will not save them. It will not save the West. It will just prolong the inevitable. And it's the same with figures like Trump, right? Or, I mean, Viktor Orban, maybe. He calls it the age of the Caesars, Spengler, where like in the terminal stage of the West, you have these strong men that try to stem the tide of decline, basically. But of course, it will not really, I mean, it will, again, prolong it, but it will not really stop it. It will not reverse it because it is not possible.
Couple things on that. So again, my views, as you know, and my audience certainly does, are the opposite. Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with
I'm
that
familiar,
one.
yes.
So one of the characteristics that he identifies as being distinctly Western, and I would agree, is dynamism and our ability to reinvent ourselves. And so one way, and this is just a counterpoint to yours, but one way to think about it is that it's not the West that's dying. It's a current iteration of the West. It's this democratic man or faux democratic man. Maybe it's the globalist man and order, that is actually dying. What's gestating inside of it is something new, some reinvention. This is what I think. That being said, we talked about what philosophy is in the West. And just to briefly summarize what you said, and I agree wholeheartedly with most of it, that we're sort of on empty. You know, the tank is running out of fuel, if you will. Now, I disagree with the direction. I think that the car engine may collapse and then we could sort of rebuild a new car. In fact, one may enable the other. But that being said, let's talk for a moment about what you think philosophy for the West should be. And then we'll talk about what philosophy is becoming in the rest of the world, because I think that's important as well. And I want to leave you with another Jorjani quote, because he says, "The philosopher's task is to challenge the gods, to reimagine both the natural and the normative order, and to wrest from them the secret fire that can illuminate a new epoch of human existence." What's your thought? What should philosophy for the West be today?
Well, that's what it should be. I mean, again, complete agreement. I mean, that's the Promethean spirit that Jorjani advocates. But again, in my pessimistic opinion, there's no fire left for Prometheus to steal and give to mankind. And this is the dilemma, right? So, for example, Ernst Jünger, right, is a very famous German writer who came to prominence.
Very popular.
Yes.
Getting more popular.
Right, absolutely. I mean, he came to prominence in the, I would say, Weimar Republic when he published his novel about his autobiographical book about his experiences in the trenches in World War I.
Yes.
And he was part of the conservative revolution. Was a hardcore nationalist in the interwar years. Later did LSD with Albert Hoffman also. I mean, he had a really, really interesting life. I think it was 103 when he died. And,
wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's true. And shortly before he died, he converted to Catholicism as well.
Interesting.
And, well, he wrote a famous book. I mean, one of his most famous philosophical books is called The Worker, Der Arbeiter. Yes. And what is it about? It's about total mobilization, because basically he describes the modern West, the modern society, contemporary society, where everything is mechanized, technologized, people become units, basically. And well, he got inspired partly by his experiences during World War I, right? Because World War I was the first real mechanized warfare, basically, that sort of became impersonal. It was not the same as previous battles, right? And he just translated this to, I mean, civilian life, like factories, basically.
Yes.
I mean, what is happening today.
Yes.
And I mean, he wrote this book, again, like I don't know, 70 years ago, maybe, yes, or 80 years ago. So, and today everything has advanced even more, right? I mean, this sort of like addiction and at the same time dependence on technology that Martin Heidegger, by the way, also decried. But as we know, there's nothing we can do about it, especially now with the advent of artificial intelligence. And well, going back to Jorjani, because you mentioned Jorjani, because Jorjani believes there will be a sort of spectral revolution,
Yes.
right, at some point in the near future, where like parapsychological phenomena will be taken seriously by science
Yes.
and will become part of everyday life.
Yes.
Yes. It's a possibility. I'm not saying it's not possible.
It's
right?
interesting, just a quote to supplement that point. Tesla famously said something about the minute that science considers the immaterial world,
Right.
it will advance
Yes, exactly.
greater in
Yes.
a decade than it has in a century or a millennium.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, that's Jorjani's argument, and by the way, he thinks he's a reincarnation of Tesla. By the way,
Really?
Jorjani.
Okay.
Yes. So
Interesting.
right. So I think we live now in a West that has lost all values basically, because the will to power, as expressed by Nietzsche, the idea of making yourself into meaning, basically sculpting yourself into meaning, which is basically what the Übermensch or the Overman is all about. I think that's completely gone, because like all the values, the so-called values that the West now subscribes to are basically anti-values. Yes, like I don't know, tolerance, quote unquote freedom, which is not really freedom, right? Liberalism, as you mentioned earlier, is sort of like George Orwell's 1984, right? They're just phrases, but they actually mean the opposite. Like, I don't know, war is peace, freedom is slavery,
Sure.
basically. Yes. I don't think that there is a way out for the West. I don't think the West has the power or has the energy, the strength to pull itself out, to sort of resurrect itself. I think that sort of ties into the demographic situation as well. Because, I mean, it's way below replacement level. I just read an article the other day. Just in Nigeria alone, more people are born than in the entirety of Europe every year, including Russia.
Well, but that's not all that uncommon. I mean, Western peoples have historically been a minority anyway. I mean,
Right.
you go back centuries, there were more people in India and China than there were in the West for large swaths of time. Couple things that want to get your opinion on, but before we get there, would you say then, because the question was, what philosophically should we do? And you agreed with Jorjani's point that we need to regain the fire, if you will. What does that mean? So what would it take to convince you that that fire, that torch was being relit? A couple things to note. There's everybody's favorite movie, I suppose, in the West for a long time, particularly in our circles, was Fight Club. Because Fight Club, which was very Nietzschean in many ways,
Yes.
of course, was essentially about revolt. It was
Right.
about mutiny. It was about attack, offense,
Right.
not defense.
Yes.
And you mentioned a lot of these terms that are so evacuated of meaning. Nobody really believes in them, except, I would argue, a narrow crop of elites who are increasingly, I think, incompetent and irrelevant. This is what I would say. But there is a kind of masco-nationalist fire that was expressed in that film over 20 years ago. You might even argue that The Matrix was very similar, albeit expressed differently, but that this mutiny, this revolt, then began to manifest itself online, began to manifest itself in the manosphere, perhaps in circles that you traveled as well. Do you not see in those movements, let's say the Red Pill community, the manosphere, maybe even the Groyper movement, okay, things of this nature, do you not see a kind of masco-nationalist, this is a term I use, fire, that's incubating there, that's only beginning to start? And furthermore, do you not think that this chaos, this crisis, as you see it, this tidal wave, demographically and otherwise, could not actually be the catalyst for that? In other words, it could break containment, and all of a sudden, the tolerance and the democracy and the multiculturalism and so forth, not only are those things irrelevant, but they just dissolve. and that sort of then ignites the fire that's been sort of building for a long time. Do you think that philosophically, maybe we're ready for that? Should we do something about that? Setting aside whether or not it's happening, but how would you react to that philosophically? Does a new meta-politics need to be wrapped around that to sort of inspire it? Is that not what Jorjani's kind of doing? Do we need other philosophers, other philosophical energy behind that? Or is it pointless?
Well, it's not pointless. I would say it's mostly reactive, though. Yes, I think Jorjani is very positive, the way he couches it, so to speak.
Yes.
The Groypers, in my opinion, are very negative in many ways, right? Because they're just basically bitching about a lot of things, right? About the sad state of affairs in the West, specifically the United States, where they're most popular. And people don't like whiners in general. Like,
Yes.
I mean, talking about the mainstream,
Yes.
right? I mean, people generally admire confident people
Yes.
that actually have a vision of something positive,
Yes.
something that can be created,
Yes.
right? Not just the reactive, like, oh no, there's a certain cabal of people that
Yes.
control us and nothing we can do. They're manipulating us, and the immigrants, and oh my God, it's all terrible, and Trump sucks, and this person sucks. Because it's whining. People
Yes.
don't like whiners. They don't inspire, right? So if you really want to change things, you need, as you said, or as Jorjani said, you need this Promethean fire, something forward-looking, right? Some new vision,
Yes.
which Jorjani provides, like with the spectral revolution, for example, which is, in my opinion, very inspiring. I just don't see how it can have mass appeal, right? And how it can actually change society, how it can move away from the fringes, so to speak.
Yes.
Yes. So I think the West is spent, as I said earlier. I mean, I think the future is in the East, and that includes Russia, because, like, again, Spengler specifically says that Russia is, he doesn't consider it part of the West, right? And he says that Russia is a very young culture, right? It still has a youthful vigor. And I think just by being here, I mean, you've been here for almost 2 months now. I mean, what do you think? Like, you've been in Europe, Western Europe, for quite a while. Now you're in Russia, in Moscow. How would you compare, like, the lifestyle, or just, I would say, the mental outlook of the people? Because I would say, I mean, from my experience, just from my own observations, I think in Russia, I can sense a sort of optimism, a sort of like vigor, like the sense of a civilizational mission that people have.
Yes.
Right? And it's not only reactive. Yes. And I can see the same in China, by the way, and India.
Yes.
I mean, if we want to really quickly touch on the idea of multipolarity,
Yes.
because the main idea is that now you have different civilizational poles coming to the fore, asserting themselves,
Yes.
right? Like decoupling themselves from the previous Western hegemon, which is clearly dying. But like the United States, as the leader of the West, I mean, the United States itself now, under the new administration, the Trump administration, the MAGA revolution, as I call it, has basically decoupled itself from globalism. So the global homo has moved to Western Europe, right? So Western Europe is now the capital of this decaying liberal order, basically, and because they still believe in this messianic sort of Rudyard Kipling white man's burden, the idea that the West,
The jungle and the garden.
yeah, exactly, so that the West still has to go and make the savages good and white again,
Right,
basically, right?
Well, I would
So-
say a couple things, and then I want to develop the multipolar man, if you will, and what exactly that means. I'll say a couple things, and I'll answer your question about Russia. One is this term of this idea of youthfulness. So, what I am fond of saying is that actually, the United States is very young.
Right.
I mean, we've only been around barely 500 years, depending on where you want to start it. Some would start it, at 1776, so not even really 300 years, okay? I wouldn't. I would go back to 1620, which is when my ancestors landed in North America, and I think when the process of civilization building actually began. But either way, either demarcation, I mean, Russia, 1,000-year history, Deutschland, France, I mean, England itself, you're talking about minimum 1,000 years, depending on where you want to start it. I would actually argue the United States is a very adolescent power, and that part of what's happening is we're becoming an adult. So that's one way to sort of reframe what's thinking. The other is I 100% agree with you about the reactive nature of what's happened politically, but I think that's a good thing because I think that is the embryonic stage for a constructiveness. And what I've argued on podcasts and in my content is actually what you're beginning to see now is the realization of a new vision to sort of mass mobilize. And what's ironic about this is that a lot of Spenglerian critique of technology, I actually think has been to some degree inverted. Part of the despair of the West right now is deindustrialization. It's actually rejecting the machinery, the factories that we use to become a great power. And now what do? Well, we're sort of soft power, which is kind of weak in and of itself if you think about it. So I think I would accept the premise of what you're saying and draw a very different conclusion. And that being that, no, we're actually headed towards a vision. And I would argue that that vision is firing on all cylinders across the West and may even be led in Western Europe, where you say it's dead, in part because it is dead in Western Europe. I mean, the elites are just completely worthless. The economy is broken, and that means you hit rock bottom. And that brings me to Russia. If you were to go back 20 years, and I'm going to frame this as a question because I was not here 20 years ago, I would echo your sentiments that the Russians are on the upswing, that actually the special military operation, which began in 2022 and was supposed to be the death knell. This is what people thought in DC at the time.
Right.
Has actually revitalized. Maybe it's consolidated a lot of the Russian redevelopment and gains that started about 20, 25 years ago. However, if you were to go back 20, 25 years ago and you were to say to the Russians, look, in 20 years, the homelessness on the street, the decay, the dilapidated buildings, the rampant corruption, this is going to reverse. And you're going to be in a much more ascendant position. They would have said, this is ridiculous, nonsense. I would say that a very similar sentiment would have been expressed in China in the 1980s. And yet in both places, it was the chaos of things, the breakdown that caused the revitalization. Now, that all depends on will, as you alluded to a moment ago. Will, fire, what have you. But it was hard to tell at that stage. Nonetheless, yes, I think the Russians are on the upswing. But there is still a sort of cautiousness about that. This is what I see. In other words, I don't see a rabid self-confidence yet. What I see is a sense of, hey, things are getting better. We're moving in the right direction. But maybe we're still behind the West. Maybe this conflict will change that. I don't know. That leads me to my next question. What is the multipolar man to you? You know, Alexander Dugin, who I know you're close to, has talked about civilization of civilizations that are on these sort of different trajectories and maybe revitalizing or actualizing in different ways. What is the multipolar man from your vantage point? Is it that? Is it something more monolithic? And how do you juxtapose that with the decline of the West?
Well, you talked about Russia 20 years ago, and
Yes.
you argued that 20 years ago, I mean, people back then would have had a hard time predicting that Russia would rise again, basically from the so-called ashes.
Mm-hmm.
But I would actually argue that the situation of the West right now is much, much, much more dire than the situation Russia was in 20 years ago. Because Russia 20 years ago, materially, yes, it was on its knees, right? But not spiritually, right? Because it hadn't lost its spirit, right? Its will to live.
Yes.
It was still very strong. I was actually here 20 years ago, and it was palpable even back then.
Yes.
Right? I don't feel it in the West, right? Because the West, I mean, it's becoming materially destitute as well now, with the economy going down basically in countries like Germany, and you can sense it when you walk around, like big cities like Frankfurt or Berlin, for example, and with a mass of immigrants all over the place, right? So basically Germans are becoming ethnically replaced, right? I mean, not just Germans, I mean Western Europeans. I think it's much more serious what is happening in Western Europe. Therefore, I don't think it's a valid comparison, right? In my opinion.
Makes sense.
Yes, I think the situation in Western Europe is much more serious. And by the way, I completely agree with you. What you said about America, like Russia, it's a youthful nation basically in its teenage years, so to speak. I agree, and I'm much more optimistic about the United States being revived basically to its former glory than Western Europe. Right? I have more hope in the U.S. than Western Europe. Talking about the multipolar man, I don't think there is a multipolar man, to be honest. I mean, you have multipolarity, and it's just as I said previously, it's a reassertion of civilizations, basically, the reassertion of sovereignty and the reassertion of their own, right, as opposed to this unipolar, global slop culture that was basically imposed on them, right, by the West for decades, right? Like, I don't know, and you see it here in Russia. I mean, well, you used to see it here to some extent. You still do. You had Starbucks, McDonald's, all that stuff. A lot of that is gone now, right? Because of the sanctions. So no more McDonald's, no more Starbucks. They were all replaced by, well, Russian counterparts, right? I mean, they serve the same coffee, same food as McDonald's. They just have different names now.
But you think that's significant?
I think it's significant because it's the first step to sovereignization. And the same with the fact that, like, no, I mean, of course, they still watch Hollywood movies, but not to the same extent that they used to. They're not idolized anymore. And when I talk to Russians, like even with pop music, like, or music in general, I think like Russian music is way more popular with Russian lyrics, Russian singers than Western music.
Right.
Yes. And I think Russian movies and TV series also gaining in prominence. And the same is true in India. I lived in India for 3 years. I mean, in India, I think it was always the case that Bollywood movies, like Hindi movies, with Indian themes from also mythology and their legends, their heritage, are infinitely more popular. Like in India, almost nobody watches Hollywood movies. Maybe the westernized elite, right? But the general masses are really only interested in Indian-produced movies. The same with music. And I think in Africa you have the same, right? I mean, because you have like Ibrahim Traore, for example, from the Sahel Alliance, fighting against neo-colonialism, also asserting their sovereignty, yes, and going back to their roots, their African legends, their African traditions. And in China with Confucianism, you see it, yes, which is, I mean, China is nominally communist, but it's not really communist, right? It's communist in name.
Absolutely,
right?
I would echo that.
It's an.
I can't stress that enough,
Right.
because the prevailing narrative in D.C. in particular, I don't know what it is in Western Europe, but it's basically you have the Chi Coms.
Exactly.
And this
Right.
is absurd. And
Totally.
I've been to China. I mean, you could argue, I think convincingly actually, that the Chinese have a more free market system than the United States does today.
Right.
Which is, I know, very difficult to understand in the West. But if you consider the volume of competition
Right.
and the sort of local provincial drivers of economy, because again, in the West, everybody thinks it's Beijing that drives everything. This is just not the case.
Right.
And when you go to different provinces, and I was really only in Hong Kong, but I have a lot of friends in China that have traveled extensively, and I plan to go as well. I know you've been there. It's just
No, I've never been to China.
okay. Oh,
I'd like to
thought
go
you
though.
had. Yeah,
one day.
Well, in any case, it is absolutely in line with what you're saying, and that self-confidence
Right.
is there too, and the desire to be entrepreneurial
Right.
is very strong in
Yes.
China.
Yes, I agree. It's basically an archaeo-futurist traditional society. Yes. So I mean, Guillaume Faye, the French thinker, he coined the term archaeo-futurism, right? Where he was trying to fight against the Luddite tendency
Yes.
of the old right, basically, that always try to reject technology,
Yes.
progress,
Yes.
saying, oh, it's evil, you know.
Yeah.
And he said, well, it's not evil, it just is. You have to accept it, like I mentioned earlier, like
Right.
Julius Evola, the Italian philosopher, you have to ride the tiger, basically. Yes? Don't get eaten by the tiger, ride the tiger.
Yes.
And he said, you have to embrace technology because it's not going to go away. You have to harness it, but at the same time, you have to stay true to your ancestors, basically.
Yes.
And that's what the Chinese are doing. That's what the Russians are doing now.
Yes.
That's what India is doing under Modi, like the Hindu nationalist government, like with their space programs named after the Hindu gods. And well, that's the multipolar man, basically. It's the man who stays true to his civilization and is the opposite of the globalized man, basically, the rootless cosmopolitan that has been so prevalent for so many decades. But I think he's on the retreat now, this
Yes.
rootless cosmopolitan. And In his place will step the sovereign man who's an individual, right? He's not like some part of a communist collective, right?
Yes.
But he's a strong individual, but you can only be a strong individual, you can only express yourself if you're rooted in your own ethnos and ethos at the same time.
Right.
Right.
3 questions on this, and we'll wrap up. One is that, the Chinese is very interesting. Having read some of their documents, they will always talk about advanced manufacturing or free markets with Chinese characteristics.
Right.
With Chinese characteristics.
Yes.
And this is an inversion of the way we currently think of in the West, and this speaks to the philosophy. And that is that we think system, then people. The Chinese think people, then system. I think that's a better orientation. That's one. 2 questions. One is, how should Western man, let's set aside for a moment your eschatology, which is that the West is sort of finished. But let's just set that aside for a moment. How should the West react to multipolar man? 1. And 2, do you think that multipolar man, as you expressed it, can actually revitalize the West? Do you think we could actually be activated by this fusion of an embrace of the future and tradition at the same time?
Well, theoretically, it's possible, and I certainly hope so, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not against revitalization of the West. I'm totally for it.
Yes.
I mean, I would like nothing more than a revitalization of the West. I'm just not as optimistic as you, basically.
Sure.
But theoretically speaking, what the West needs to do, it basically needs to rid itself of all these illusions, these masks it's wearing. One of them is liberalism. The second one is capitalism, like this slavish devotion to capitalism. I'm not saying it should be communist.
Randian capitalism.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
Right. So liberalism.
The market is the god that I must worship.
Well, liberal capital, Manchester capitalism.
Yeah.
It needs
market forces solve all our problems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it needs to rid itself of this, and democracy, and the whole false notion of freedom that it basically constantly espouses, and at the same time contradicting it all the time. So it needs to go back basically to tradition, to hierarchy, to order, to will to power. And I would argue, by the way, because a lot of Westerners always say, I mean, the mainstream Westerners, like the establishment media, they keep saying that, well, but all these despots, dictatorships, this is anti-Western, because the West, the true West is free, it's democratic, blah, blah, blah. But it's totally false, right? Because if you look at European history, for thousands and thousands of years, the West was anything but democratic. It was always, quote-unquote, despotic.
Yes.
You had kings, emperors, right? Dictators. Yes. I mean, the whole, quote-unquote, democratic period is very, very small in Western history compared to the hierarchical period, which it needs to return to. I mean, the ideal vision that I have of a revitalized Europe, I mean, I dedicate a whole chapter in my book, Multipolarity, about this vision. It's basically an archaeo-futurist Holy Roman Empire. That's what we need. Well, like Hilaire Belloc, who said that the church is Europe, Europe is the church. So it needs to be Christian, because Christianity is the foundation of the West, in my opinion. It needs to be, I would say, almost theocratic, right? So it needs to have a firm foundation on Christian values, Christian basis, basically.
Metaphysics.
Yes, it needs to be a federation, an imperial construct, like the Holy Roman Empire, because only in an imperial construct can the regions be protected, because nationalism, or the whole idea of the nation state, is also leveling, right? I mean, we see it in Spain or France, like with the Basques, for example. They're totally suppressed. That's what nation states do. They try to universalize people to become citizens of the nation, and regional particularities are erased, basically. But in an empire, this is not the case. I mean, you can look at the Roman Empire, for example. You had like Germania, you had Judea, right? 2 examples. I mean, the Jews were allowed to worship as they please, and the Germanics as well. All that was expected of them is to pay their respects to the emperor, right?
Yes.
Which the Jews refused to do. And that's why you had the war, right, between the Romans and the Jews. But they never ever, like today, like the whole melting pot idea in the United States, they never try to make everybody the same, basically, and make everybody conform.
Yes.
So the idea of empire is basically ethno-pluralist, right? Where you have different ethnic groups in the empire, because an empire by nature is always multi-ethnic, right? But they're all respected. And since we're in Russia right now, I would say that the Russian Federation is a very good example, because, I mean, Russia has basically never been a nation state. It's always been an empire. I mean, you had the Russian Empire, you had the Soviet Union, which was an empire,
Yes.
and now you have the Russian Federation, it's
Yeah.
basically also an empire. I mean, today, like political scientists, they use the term civilizational state.
Right,
Yes, but it's a
right.
euphemism, it's empire, it's the same thing. So today, in the multipolar world, we have 4 civilizational states. Yes, we have the United States, we have the Russian Federation, we have India, and we have China. Yes, because all 4 of them constitute unique civilizations, but are also united in a political form as a state, right? And all of them are sovereign because all of them have nuclear weapons. Without nuclear weapons, you're not sovereign. Yes, like for example, the Islamic world is a civilization, but it's not a civilizational state because it's not one entity, one political entity. It's fragmented. It could become one, right?
Yes.
It might. Who knows? But just to go back real quick to the Russian Federation, the idea of empire as a model for Western Europe, the archaeofuturist Holy Roman Empire that I envision, is basically like you have a sizable Muslim population. It's a minority, but they have their own autonomous republics like Tatarstan and Chechnya, for example.
yes.
Well, a lot of people in the West don't understand this because I hear this sometimes on social media like X, when people say, Russia is swamped with Muslims and so on. Was not really true, because these Muslims, like the Tatars or the Chechens, they've been part of Russian history for centuries.
Long time,
They're an integral part of Russian society. And in Russia, you have these 2 terms, Ruski and Rasyanin, right? Rasyanin basically means a citizen of Russia. So a Chechen, for example, is a Rasyanin because he's a citizen of the Russian Federation, but he's not a Ruski. Ruski is an ethnic Russian.
Slav.
And they do differentiate, right? Well, when Putin speaks, because he's the president of the Russian Federation, he always uses Rasyanin, obviously, as he should, right? Because these are all imperial subjects.
Yes.
And if you go to Chechnya, for example, they're fiercely loyal to the center, which is Moscow.
Yes.
And this is why they have so much autonomy to do their own thing,
Yes.
like linguistically and culturally,
Yes.
which is how it should be in an empire.
Yeah.
And this is how Western Europe should be in the future. Like, it should have this
This is your
imperial
vision, yeah.
ethos. That's my vision.
Yeah.
That would be my ideal vision of a resurrected Europe.
I mean, it makes sense. I would say I think the West is different because I agree with what you're saying about Russia and China, to be sure, although China is also an ethno-state.
Right.
That's very clear. It's very monolithic in that sense. Yes, there are dialectics. Yes, there are differences, but more or less it's the Han-Chinese. The United States is...
Well, you have other ethnicities, though, in China as well.
Yes, but
right?
the core...
Right, well, the core.
And,
right.
and the metaphysical
Well, it's
sense is rooted in that.
Sorry, just real quick, since you mentioned the core, it's very interesting because in German you have the term Reichsvolk. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's like the imperial people, because of course it's the core people around which the empire is built.
Sure.
The empire builders. Well, in the Roman Empire was the Romans, obviously.
Yes.
In Russia is the ethnic Russians, and that's why, well, Russian is the administrative language, and it's the leading culture is the Russian culture. That doesn't mean other cultures are denigrated or somehow suppressed, but everybody sort of follows
There's
this
a foundation.
model. Right.
Yes.
And I guess that's what you're talking about with China, with the Han. They're like the imperial people.
Yes,
right?
and philosophically, I mean, I would say that the poles of Sino-civilization are Confucius and Lao Tzu.
Right.
And ironically enough, those two actually go together quite well, despite being very, very different, right? Because Confucianism is essentially paternal hierarchy.
Right.
And Lao Tzu is kind of equilibrium. It's kind of balance of the universe. In some ways, they oppose, but they actually marry one another because hierarchy can suffocate without liberation.
Right.
So you need this kind of balance, and that's what they have. But I would say in the United States and in Western Europe, I would sort of string the thread or the needle this way. I would say an imperial overarching protection of Western civilization, the way that you described, sort of as imperial, I would say, is a vanguard or the guardians, maybe even the Übermensch, being a cadre of people that are protecting the sovereignty of the ethnos in the West. And I would submit, I think we're seeing the beginnings of that. And unifying those groups together, that might be the project that we're undertaking today, which is something certainly I participated in, being in Germany, Hungary, Austria, France, the United States. The goal is not to create a globalist umbrella. It is to revitalize sovereignty, but in that project, we're all unified together. And we're all fighting the same enemy, which means we can all organize together to do it. Anyway, just an interesting sort of counterpoint to your vision. It's not incongruent. It's just expressed differently from my vantage point. Let's finish with this. Part of what Jorjani says too, or what he discusses, is the importance of aesthetics. And you notice when you go through Russia, in particular, the Kremlin, St. Petersburg, you see a very monumentalized culture. It is very important to the Russians in particular. Needless to say, aesthetics has declined considerably in the West. Do you think that aesthetics are crucial? Building new things, a renaissance in an architectural sense. I mean, if you look at the United States, you go to a city like Chicago, which was planned in many ways, and you had architects like Daniel Burnham. These people created by building. Is it time? And you notice in Germany and France, the infrastructure's a mess. We know that trains don't work like they used to do. How important is it to build a new Western philosophy on a new aesthetics? Maybe an Art Deco revitalization, that type of thing. How important is that? Could that be done as the foundational pillar of a new Western philosophy?
Well, it's supremely important, and it can be done. And you can see it here in Moscow or in Russia in general, and you can compare it to the West. Like, for example, talk about sculptures. Like in the West, like Germany, for example, you can visit, castles, palaces, and Baroque castles, Rococo palaces. You can walk around like the park behind the palace or the castle, and almost always you will find modern art in the park, like some ugly box or some giant turd or something,
painting,
some nonsense in the park every single time. Even in Versailles, like I was in Versailles in France like a couple of years ago, like beautiful palace, of course, stunning. And then I walked around the park and they had these modern sculptures by some famous Indian modern artist, forgot his name, but hideous, ugly, just like weird geometric shapes and like feces basically made out of metal, right? And they do this everywhere in Europe, everywhere. I think it's by design, right? Because when you walk around, the what you see around you, which is architecture, right, which are sculptures, they directly influence your well-being, your sense of self and your sense of belonging. Because these geometrical shapes that you had in Versailles, for example, are totally alien. They're not European. They're not connected to your race soul, so to speak, right? And what is this? It's just incongruent because you see Versailles, and I, as a Western European, I feel connection to, I'm not French, but I'm Western European. So I feel a connection to
the archetypes.
Exactly.
With you.
And I want to also really quickly say it's the same with cathedrals. Right? I can go to any cathedral in Western Europe, not just Germany, but in any Western European country, and it will elevate my soul, my spirit, because I feel a part of this culture, a part of this spirit. And I don't feel it in Russia. I admire Russian culture. I'm a massive fan of Russian culture. I love Russian cathedrals, but I don't feel it. And because I'm not Russian, right? So I don't want to denigrate Russia. It's nothing to do with it. But I just don't feel it. I appreciate it, but I don't feel the connection because I'm not a part of it. You know what I mean?
I do.
It's the same in India. I go to Hindu temples. Massive, beautiful, beautiful, intricate carvings, lovely. But I'm not a part of it. I don't have this spiritual elevation welling up inside of me that I feel when I go to cathedrals in England, cathedrals in France, Belgium, or Germany. There I feel it because I'm a direct part of it. It is the race soul, basically, right? That speaks. Well, Carl Jung talks about this, a Swiss psychologist.
Morcia
And,
Eliade, I'm sure you're familiar with him.
Yes, of
too.
course.
And he talked about the axis mundi.
Exactly.
In the sacred
Right.
and the profane.
Yes.
All the sacred cultures, the
Right.
mythology has an axis mundi.
Yes, absolutely.
And this is what you're talking
Right.
about.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think this is being purposely destroyed by adding these incongruent elements to it. I think it is definitely by
sense.
design. It's done on purpose. So if you want to revitalize Europe,
Yes.
it's of the utmost importance to get rid of this garbage
Yes.
on the trash heap where it belongs, not
Yes.
even in a museum, just away, gone,
Yes.
and have real European art,
Right.
modern art,
Right.
but classical at the same time.
Yes.
And in Russia, they do it, right? So in Russia, they erect new monuments all
Absolutely.
the time. Like I was here in 1914, they erected the very first World War I monument
You mean
because
2014?
2014, yes,
Yes.
for the 100th anniversary. For the
Not reincarnated.
no time traveling. Yes. So for the 100th anniversary of World War One,
Yes.
they erected this World War One monument in completely classical style, but also
Yes.
modern, right, with a Russian
Yes.
flag and stylized soldiers.
Yes.
Absolutely beautiful, right? Unthinkable in the contemporary West. It could never be done.
Yes.
They would put up some hideous, like some I don't know, some fat chick, whatever. I don't know.
Yes.
That's what they do. Right?
Absolutely.
With a cell phone instead. It's just like, ugh, what is this? Right?
Andrea Palladio, Palladian architecture. He literally wrote an instructive set of books or a manual of sorts for architecture. He said the purpose of architecture is threefold: calm, harmony, and dignity.
Yes.
Dignity being, I think, the preeminent point here. You cannot have a sense of self-respect and meaning and consequentialism if you are not beautified.
Yes.
And if that beauty does not represent
Yes.
your archetype, your
Exactly.
sense of self, your axis mundi.
Yes. Well, I was in Washington, D.C., for example, this year in January at a inauguration party for Trump at the
Yes.
Watergate Hotel. And I walked around Washington, and even there I felt connected, right? Because it is, again, it's
Western.
my culture, it's Western, like the imperial style of Washington,
Yes.
because it's modeled on Greek architecture, ancient Greek
And
models.
consciously
basically.
so.
Yeah, I know.
Yes.
And even there, I felt a part of it. I felt it,
Yes.
right? Because I could see these are basically my people created this.
Yes.
Yes.
And it is that feeling, my friend, that is the fire
Right.
that will be reignited.
And I hope it will be.
And on that note, it's been a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate it. And I hope for all of you a different perspective, because really what we've got to do is open our minds. So thank you very much, Constantine.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.